The very last human body system that we're going to be covering in this class is, of course, the reproductive system, which is covered in chapter 17 of our book, and we'll be doing sections 1 through 4. We will be answering the following questions. What are the functions of the reproductive system? What are the parts of the male and the female reproductive systems? How do hormones control the ovarian and uterine cycles? We want to be able to define what is fertilization and describe the human life cycle. And then we want to be able to define the terms haploid and diploid pretty well, because we're going to be using those a lot moving forward into our discussion of cell division. So first, what are the functions of the reproductive system? And while we as individuals can survive and thrive without our reproductive systems, the reproductive system is really what gives us our fitness, or quote fitness in evolutionary terms. As we'll see when we get to our unit on evolution, fitness in this case does not mean that you can do 100 pull-ups or run a 4-minute mile. Evolutionary fitness refers to an individual's ability to pass along their genetic information, and that would be in the form of creating an offspring. For humans, this desire to reproduce can be kind of muddled by ethical concerns like overpopulation and our ability to detect genetic abnormalities, then it can affect quality of life. And that's a really interesting topic that we can talk more about in our unit on biotechnology later next week. But the functions of the reproductive system are really to produce gametes and to produce the sex hormones needed to stimulate the process of reproduction, all with that goal of passing genetic information along to our offspring. The gametes are cells that we create that contain a single set of DNA. So the majority of our cells contain 2 sets of DNA, one that we inherited from our parents, or from each of our parents, one from our mother and one from our father. But when we create a gamete is a haploid cell, which means that it only contains a single set of DNA, one copy of each gene. Most cells in our bodies, called somatic cells, contain 2 copies of each gene, one from each parent. In order to reproduce, though, we need to pare down that information to that single set so that it can be paired with another cell, another gamete, from the other parent. So sperm cells are the haploid gametes produced by males, and then the egg is the haploid gamete produced by females. And then in order to create an offspring, we know that that sperm and the egg must come together and join those single sets of DNA into a complete set, creating another diploid cell. Diploid meaning that it contains a complete set of DNA to code for a human being. The joining of those 2 gametes into a single diploid cell is called fertilization. And then this cell that's created is then called a zygote. So we'll see those terms again when we get to a more detailed description of the human life cycle. Biologically speaking, the role of the male reproductive system is really just to donate the sperm that are fit enough to reach the egg, and then you're done. The role of the female reproductive system is to donate the egg, but then also to create a hospitable environment for the sperm to fertilize the egg, and then for the zygote to grow and develop into a new individual. That single-celled zygote grows into a multicellular individual through a process of cell division called mitosis, which is the process of creating another exact copy of the original cell. We'll talk about that more in the next chapter. Really interesting. The gametes that come together to form that zygote were formed through a process of cell division called meiosis. So we'll talk about mitosis and meiosis in chapter 19. So we'll start with the male reproductive system, and as we're all well aware, there are some big differences between the male and female reproductive systems, both anatomically and physiologically, due to the very different roles that they play in the process of human reproduction. The most important functional parts of both systems are called the gonads, because those are the parts that produce the gametes and the sex hormones that drive reproduction. In males, the gonads are the testes. There are 2 testes contained within the scrotum. Sperm are very sensitive to temperature, which is why the testes are housed external to the body cavity. But they also have the ability to be drawn into the body cavity as temperature conditions change. So the scrotum is also lined with extra sweat glands to quickly cool that area and protect sperm from large temperature fluctuations. The epididymis is the coiled tubule where sperm are matured and are housed until they are then stimulated to leave the body. So that's where they're going to live for the majority of the time that they're there, which really isn't very long. The vas deferens is the tube that connects the epididymis to the urethra. And then the urethra we've seen before is the shared tubule that conducts both semen and urine out of the male body. And then the urethra also houses the male sex organ, which is the penis. And we can recall from our discussion, hopefully, of the urinary system that the male urethra will carry each of these fluids only one at a time and not simultaneously. But sperm cells actually make up very little of the volume of semen. The prostate gland and the seminal vesicles secrete all of the other products that make up semen. So the prostate secretions are slightly basic and activate the sperm to make them capable of moving quickly towards the egg once they reach the female reproductive system. And also, this acts to counteract the slight acidity of the female system. So we remember that because of our shorter urethra, the female urinary system and reproductive system really are more susceptible to infection. So that slightly acidic environment is not hospitable to bacteria or viruses, which could cause infection, but unfortunately is also not hospitable to sperm. So having that slightly basic substance surrounding the sperm can counteract that environment when it reaches the female reproductive system. And then the secretions formed by the seminal vesicles include fructose to provide the sperm with energy to reach the egg. And then the vesicles also make amino acids, which is what makes semen such a thick substance, sticky. Spermatogenesis is the process of creating sperm. So in order to create a gamete, a haploid cell, a specialized cell called a spermatogonium will undergo several rounds of cell division. And we'll look at this process of those cell divisions later. But for now, we should know that sperm cells are haploid, meaning they contain only a single set of DNA because of those repeated rounds of cell division, paring down the amount of DNA that is in those cells. And this process of spermatogenesis, or the formation of sperm cells, happens within the seminiferous tubules. Looking at the female reproductive system, if the gonads in the male reproductive system were the testes, the female gonads are then the ovaries, where the eggs are produced. The biggest difference here is that while male genitalia is mostly external, female genitalia is mostly internal. So just like the male has two testes, the female reproductive system has two ovaries, which lie on either side of the uterus. And then the oviducts extend from the uterus to each one, but they don't attach directly to the ovaries. Oviducts are most commonly called fallopian tubes also. You're probably more familiar with that term. The oviducts carry immature egg cells from the ovary to the uterus. And if sperm is present and fertilization occurs, that will typically happen within the oviduct. And then the zygote, that fertilized egg, making that diploid cell, will then be transferred to the uterus. If the zygote implants successfully in the uterus, then the uterus is what will provide the zygote and then eventually the fetus with nourishment and will expand up to roughly 60 times its original size to accommodate that growing fetus. Because it has to get so big, and it has multiple functions to push that fetus out if necessary, the walls of the uterus have two layers of tissue. The muscular layer is what will allow the uterus to contract during childbirth, and this is going to be made of smooth muscle because this contraction is going to be under involuntary control. And the second layer is the endometrium. The endometrial lining varies in thickness during the uterine cycle, and this is the layer that is shed during menstruation if an embryo is not implanted. The narrow end of the uterus that connects it to the vagina is called the cervix. And during intercourse, sperm that's deposited into the vagina then must travel through an opening in the cervix and then make it all the way to the oviduct to find the egg. Kind of amazing that all of those things have to happen. We almost kind of forget about the mammary glands, but they are the last part of the reproductive system. Mammary glands are actually found in both males and females, but are only stimulated to produce milk in females by the female sex hormones. The presence of mammary glands in males, though, is what causes some swelling in males during puberty and causing them to think they're developing breasts like their female peers. So that can probably be a little bit discerning, but that is because both males and females actually contain mammary glands, but the hormonal trigger to cause them to produce milk is only going to happen in females during that process of reproduction. So let's look at our ovarian and uterine cycles. Ovarian cycle refers to the process of egg production, so producing that gamete. And then the uterine cycle is the creation and shedding of that endometrial layer to create the hospitable environment for that growing zygote, embryo, and fetus. The coordination of these two cycles is carefully controlled by hormones. So we're going to see a large influence from the endocrine system here. Those hormones then are delivered by the anterior pituitary gland, and then additional sex hormones are produced by the ovaries. First, we have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and these are both produced by the anterior pituitary. The release of these hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus. So just like we saw in all those other examples when we talked about the endocrine system, that hypothalamus was the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, kind of telling the body when and where to release those hormones. Together, these two hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, signal to the ovary to start producing two more hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And the presence of estrogen and progesterone in the blood then causes the anterior pituitary to decrease the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. This is a really good example of a negative feedback mechanism. The presence of the two female sex hormones causes the pituitary to reduce their output, negative feedback. Then, as the levels of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone decline, the levels of estrogen and progesterone will also decline because it's this hormone from the pituitary that are telling the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. And once the levels of estrogen and progesterone decrease, that will reduce the inhibition on the anterior pituitary, and it will start releasing follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormones again. This constant interaction between the levels of these four hormones in the blood is what creates a cycle. When levels of estrogen and progesterone are at their lowest, this is what will trigger menstruation. This is called the uterine cycle. If menstruation occurs due to low estrogen and progesterone, the anterior pituitary will release more follicle-stimulating hormone, which will trigger the production of a new egg, releasing follicle in the ovary. This production of an egg on a follicle is part of the ovarian cycle. So as the uterus is losing its previous endometrial lining, the ovary is preparing this new egg for the next cycle, and the timing of the two are coordinated by the same hormone interactions so that they remain in sync. As the egg matures in the ovary, the lining of the uterus thickens again due to the increased levels of estrogen stimulating cell division. And when the new egg and follicle are mature, luteinizing hormone is released by the pituitary, causing an egg to undergo meiotic cell division, and then causing it to be moved along the oviduct towards the uterus.